Stevie Wonder was born prematurely. He has a condition called retinopathy prematura. Ray Charles had congenital glaucoma. There's a blues guitarist named Doc Watson that had corneal scarring. I decided I wanted to know more about blind musicians. I just got fascinated, and I could not stop reading biographies of Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles and Andrea Bocelli, and then starting to look at the neurology and what happens in the brain when someone is born blind and what happens to the auditory areas and the visual areas in the brain. You know, I'm a musician. Right around the time that I knew that I had this little benign tumor and started losing hearing, I just became interested in the stories of visually impaired artists. And so there's a whole wonderful book that I read that talks about how Monet had cataracts and Edgar Degas, another impressionist painter, had probably some sort of retinal dystrophy and he started losing vision. All these different stories, Georgia O'Keeffe and James Thurber and Mary Cassatt and all these people who lost vision and still managed to create this incredible art. And I just must have researched that topic for over a year, wrote note cards just like I was in high school, writing my note cards out, and I wrote this book called The Blind Musician, which I had hoped would be sort of a one-stop source for everything you could possibly want to know: history, biographies, neurology, ophthalmology, the definitive one-stop book on blind musicians. And this notion of neuroplasticity, which is kind of a fancy way of saying your brain kind of gets adapted to stuff. They will have floaters, little pieces of junk floating around in the vitreous jelly. Your brain will eventually adapt to this. It's not like the floater goes away, but eventually you're not going to pay attention to it. A much more advanced version of that is occurring in blind musicians, particularly those who are blind at an early age. What happens there is it becomes kind of like an auxiliary supercomputer, and it starts processing auditory and tactile things, so it's like you get an extra part of the brain devoted to hearing and sound. And through that process of neuroplasticity, you just see that these people's brains are just very different from sighted musicians. Here are these brilliant musicians. They were born at a time either into poverty or really cruddy medical care, and had they been born today, there's just no question that we could treat them. They would not be blind. But then kind of the flip side of that is, well, would they have been the brilliant musicians that they turned out to be? And I don't know the answer to that for sure, but I kind of have to think that probably they wouldn't have been.